Good evening and welcome to the first of a 14-part webinar series titled When We See Us. My name is Thelma Golden. I am Assistant Curator here at Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art Africa in Cape Town, South Africa. Before we begin in earnest, I'd like to acknowledge everyone who's joined us this evening, of course, from various parts of the world. We are incredibly humbled for the incredible turnout we're already seeing on our stats on the platform. So thank you, and we hope this will be as engaging an interaction for you all as much as it will be for us as the hosts and speakers that are joining us tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues who have supported and shaped the development of this program at every level. I'd like to thank the various teams across all the departments at Zeitz MOCAA Museum for contributing considerable research, time, and care into the webinar series, into making the webinar series a reality. As a museum, we are also incredibly honored to be able to host a global network of esteemed thinkers, institutional leaders, and cultural practitioners for this key discursive moment. Of course, this program is conceived in collaboration with the Institute for Humanities in Africa, HUMA, at the University of Cape Town. And we are pleased to also be able to kick off this first session tonight with the gracious participation of the HUMA director himself, Divine Fa, whom I will introduce in more detail later. Zeitz MOCAA is also incredibly grateful for the support from Gucci towards our curatorial and exhibition programming. To continue, before we continue in earnest, to our audience, I must point out that to the right of your screens, you should be able to see a Q&A button, which we invite you to use to share your questions for the speakers. And during the 90-minute duration of our discussion, we will try and return to those questions towards the end of our session tonight and allow our speakers to respond. That noted, I'd also like to give a brief context to the overall program that is the When We See Us webinar series. For more than a century, Black artists, whether residing in Africa or within the vast African diaspora, have invested and pursued a spectrum of visual vocabularies that encompass the experience of Blackness, of being Black, of living within Black cultures, and navigating the complexities of representation and visibility. In doing so, they have intentionally, continuously, and effectively rejected oppressive tropes of representation that have been cast on African and Afro-diasporic lives by the Euro-American enterprise of dehumanization and segregation. That could be understood as the conceptual note and curatorial premise for hosting such a program in partnership with HUMA. This webinar series, as mentioned, is a 14-part online discursive platform. It essentially precedes a major eponymous exhibition, which Zeitz MOCAA will be opening in November 22. The exhibition and its accompanying program, including this webinar series, aim to unveil the deeper historic contexts and networks of complex and underrepresented artistic genealogies that stem from African and Black modernities, and in fact span several generations from the early 20th century to the present. As a supportive element towards the exhibition in November, this series will, over the next 9 months, right up till the 6th of December, bring together voices, we'll bring together voices, incredible voices, to discuss diverse topics that include perspectives on the subject matter at hand, from the point of view of history, contemporary visual culture, and race relations, politics, geography, artistic genealogies, self-representation, the Black Renaissance and modernities, Pan-Africanism, Afropolitanism, creolization and syncretism, gender and queering of the archive. This is a mirage of explorations that we hope will illuminate on a very timely moment in contemporary art from the continent and by artists of African descent within the diaspora. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce the speakers on tonight's webinar session. Of course, as she appears on the screen currently, is our museum director, Koyo Kouoh, who, under her fierce leadership, has been doing incredible work and continuing her renowned practice within this field of institutional building here at the Zeitz MOCAA Museum in Cape Town. We also have joining us tonight, and it is an honor, as mentioned before, Divine Fa, who joins us in his capacity as both social anthropologist and director at HUMA. His current research and work focuses on the political economy of Pan-African knowledge production, as well as on artificial intelligence and the ethics of care in Africa. He has been a visiting fellow at the Center of Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin and a guest at the African Studies Center, Leiden. We're very pleased to have his input tonight as well. And lastly, we have the immense pleasure of engaging this conversation in the company of Thelma Golden, Director and Chief Curator at Studio Museum in Harlem in New York. Of course, Thelma is a renowned champion of African American art. In her long engagement and affiliation with Studio Museum, and under her leadership, the institution has gained increased renown as a global leader in the exhibition of contemporary art, a center for innovative education, and a cultural anchor in the Harlem community itself in New York. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to our director, Koyo Kouoh, to offer additional framing for the conversation tonight and get us into the meat of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tato. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you're joining. It is amazing to be here today to launch this vast program. So it is a great enjoyment for me to kick off this 14-part webinar series focused on global Black subjectivities as they manifest through figurative painting. When we see us, or when we see us. The title of this interrelated program is inspired by African-American film director Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, her 2019 drama series, which depicts various forms of violence against Black bodies as we still witness globally today. So we wanted to flip things around and change perspective by flipping they to we. It allows us for a dialectical shift that centers the conversation in a differential perspective of self-writing as theorized by Achille Mbembe. When we see us is a framework of thinking and discussions that centers Black self-representation in the Pan-African world. Germane to the forthcoming exhibition is the notion of Black joy, Black opulence, Black wealth, Black style and aesthetics as forms of resistance to the reductive gaze cast on people of African descent by the white enterprise of dehumanization and segregation. These effects of which we are also still witnessing today. So since the beginning of the pandemic, the curatorial team at Zeitz MOCAA has been researching areas of artistic practices that meaningfully speak to the Black experiences. The results of some of those research areas are progressively manifesting in our exhibition program since the museum reopened to the public, as well as through a carefully crafted discursive engagement online. The head-to-head Instagram conversations during lockdown, as well as the Radical Solidarity Summit, of which some of you may have followed, are examples of this work. In the meantime, all the while, we've been very attentive to the renewed prominence of Black figuration and the heightened attention and success that this practice is garnering amongst curators, related art professionals, institutions, collectors, and markets over the past 5 to 7 years. We welcome this development, of course, for many reasons, not least because despite the cyclic announcement of the death of painting, painting nevertheless remains a central, indestructible medium of expression used by so many artists of our curatorial purview, that is Africa and its vast diaspora. So if written stories are essential ingredients necessary to shifting, limiting narratives about Black experiences, painted stories, and particularly figurative painting, contributes a lexicon and grammar that participates in visually writing, reading, and storing those experiences. Wonderfully powerful and timely projects have emerged in recent years to mark this moment in time for Black figuration. I would like to refer here to my colleague Adriano Pedrosa's masterfully curated Historias Afro-Atlanticas that inspired us so much in Cape Town, and that I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to see on tour at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC at the end of next week. I would also like to nod to Christine Kim's Black American Portraits, currently on view at the Los Angeles County Museum in Los Angeles. There are, of course, many more projects that address the subject matter in multidisciplinary ways, not least would also be the Zoe Whitley's critically acclaimed Soul of a Nation, as well as Wojciech Hockley's We Wanted a Revolution at the Brooklyn Museum. So despite the richness of this incredibly inspiring project, we nonetheless noticed that hardly anyone looked at this field across the various geographies of Blackness, nor have they triggered conversations that include both sides of the Atlantic in ways that defy the complexities of Blackness, nor in ways that replaces or recenters, I want to say, Africa as the matrix of anything Black. So without further ado, I really would like to engage into a conversation with my colleagues and to really get into the matter of what does it mean? Why is representation, and particularly Black representation, Black figuration, such a central node of thinking, of feeling about ourselves? Tato?
Thelma, you certainly can respond to that very pointed question from your position as someone who has also had a practice that has spanned very particular kinds of moments of exhibition histories and Black traditions of painting and other forms. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tato. And I really want to first thank and salute my colleague Koyo Kouoh. This project is in a long line of work that Koyo has done that has shifted and changed the way in which we see art and understand art histories. So it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, not only as the director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, to have this conversation happening now in her role as the leader of the Zeitz Museum, but also to say this just as a personal colleague and friend, because she has been such a light on my path in the expansion of the way in which I have thought about these sort of global Black presences in art. It's also a pleasure to be here with Divine. We are just getting to know each other, but I value what it means to have this moment of conversation, right? Across, you know, many different sort of places and modes that we might say. And, you know, we know this audience is out there, and while perhaps we might want to be in the room together, I'm also grateful for this technology, which is allowing us to have this conversation across time and space, right, today. So, you know, your question is a question that is really at the heart of the founding of an institution like the one I lead, the Studio Museum in Harlem. And it could be the question of why has this dialogue in Black art been so important, but more significantly, this dialogue around figuration and figuration's representation to a desire to think about how we picture ourselves, our history, our culture, and our humanity. You know, I think the politics of representation have so much to do with the way in which we think about how the art histories and this kind of legacy of exhibition making that have explored the notion of figuration becomes so important, because when we look at the exhibition history, you know, Koyo mentioned too many to name, but, you know, when I think about this trajectory around African-American artists, that is Black artists in the United States, you know, we can go back hundreds of years and think about this idea of representation in art being so tied to the politics of the way in which we've understood ourselves as a people. In the contemporary moment, as a curator, of course, Black figuration has been important to me as a way to enter into conversations about race and gender and sexuality and personhood. And my own exhibitions have often, in many ways, approached an idea of thinking through these ideas through art. But, you know, when Koyo first told me about this, I don't even want to call this an exhibition, because what you all are doing at Zeitz is not simply an exhibition. The exhibition is perhaps the central node of what's just a whole engagement of thought making, you know, idea making, future making, right? Through the seminars and the publication that will come and the exhibition. But when I think of my own exhibition history, and when Koyo told me about this project, I thought about an exhibition that I did in 2004 called Black Romantic. And it was my attempt in the American context of really trying to understand this question: why is figuration so important? And to do that, I took on an exhibition of art and artworks by artists who were not always considered part of our art histories, right? They lived within a sense of self-definition around the importance of figuration and the importance of figurative art and the importance of the way in which that art should be pictured in museums, but also should be in people's homes, be reproduced in the form of note cards and posters, and these artists who were interested in creating images that they felt did not exist in the world, right? So it was sort of a revolutionary act to picture a race and a culture in ways that perhaps left to mainstream media, right, and other forms of image making would not happen. So I think that is one reason that we imagine that this has been such a predominant way to think about art and art making, and why many artists have taken on the figure and figuration. But I also think figurative art has been significantly about the ongoing project in the United States, but I would say, you know, across our Black global community, it's been a part of the significant project of narrative change. It's been a way to create through visual art a significant force that shifts what we know, what we see, and what we can understand. And I think that's what perhaps is at the base of how we might talk about the work that's being made in this moment, the way in which it circulates in the world, even some of the problematics of that circulation, which I hope we'll get into. But more significantly, if we just start at a base level, living in the world that we live in, it really is about this change of narrative, a way in which to picture our humanity in ways that are self-defined, exist within the many truths of our existence, and will be emblematic for not just the present, but for those in the future to understand this project in the broadest way possible.
Thank you for that, Thelma. That really situates us quite well into this question of narrative making, into what the current saliency of Black figuration might represent or might signal within, I think, the political context of the global moment we live in today, both from a diasporic or American perspective, American-Euro perspective, as well as from the continental or global South perspective. What is making artists who work so pointedly in Black figuration, artists of African descent, what is creating a kind of, I mean, hypervisibility is often considered as a negative way of understanding the prominence of a particular visual language or style, but there's a reason why it is so foregrounded, not only within theoretical reflections or art historical investigations or re-looking at art historical moments of zeitgeists around Black figuration. There's a way in which it is a responsive visibility that occurs around Black figuration. Now, that is, without over-theorizing, I think I also want to then also point to what your perspective might be, Divine, around the politics of representation from, I suppose, a sociological understanding of what we do when we figure ourselves in the world, to sort of follow on what Thelma's position was.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tato, and thank you, Koyo, thank you, Thelma. I should really start by appreciating Zeitz MOCAA for really working hard to put this together. I think it's been like a year or two going, and it's just great to be here, to be launching this today, and just to create a space where we can revisit this question that is so important for us as a people, for the world as a human race, and also how we imagine moving forward, you know, as a better a human race or community. And just to say that I was joking earlier that I'm just here to support my sisters because it is part of who we are. When we see ourselves, part of that is to make sure that we connect and we build community, and this is really important for us, you know, as a people. I recall several years back when I was in Dakar with Koyo, with raw material, important project that she's pushed with her colleagues, you know, in Senegal, and brought together really communities of young artists, you know, growing them and also giving them a space, you know, to imagine how the continent continues, you know, to do this very important work, and seeing the work that Koyo is doing with the colleagues at Zeitz MOCAA and really pushing. I don't think people understand the energy and the difficulties, you know, behind what we see right now. So really thank you all for the work you're doing. And also it's great to meet Thelma, to get to know Thelma. I could not deny an opportunity to be with a photo up with Thelma. So it's great, you know, to be, and also to see really that important work that you and your team are doing, you know, to try to change the narrative, to shift also the imagination, and just to try to engage with this question: what do we do with ourselves? What do we do with the way the world has positioned us? What do we do with what I think Mbembe was trying to deal with in that modes of African self-writing? What do we do in a world that is made of prefixes and suffixes, you know, because, you know, we are people that is often associated with prefixes and suffixes, and you hear about the Atlantic, then you want to hear about the Black Atlantic, you know, you hear about art, you want to hear about Black art. So we have been entered a world that really precedes us and attempts to represent us in particular ways that are very problematic and that we are really struggling with. When I was coming into this talk and thinking about figuration and this history of figuring, I was reflecting on my own trajectory and thinking that I left Cameroon as a Cameroonian and then moved to Europe, in Switzerland, and I became an African. And then when I returned to South Africa, I became Black. So it's such, you know, an interesting trajectory, the ways in which the world and its encounters converts you to something else, and something that you have to keep dealing with and keep figuring on a daily basis. And I think this discussion, this conversation, this series is precisely about that. These entanglements that we find ourselves today, entanglements that have been either facilitated or created sometimes by histories that we have very little to do with. How do we deal with this long, heavy history of a diaspora that was pushed and created by a really deep violence of capitalism, where people are transformed, you know, just into objects, you know, of work, or just turned, you know, into tools. And then how do we also deal with this, what I call the second diaspora, what the people who call themselves Afropolitans, you know, with another kind of history, and through whom we also tend to begin to figure the continent, you know, what do we do with this? And I think that this particular project is about this. It's about the meanings that we write, the meaning that we continue to write, this process of constituting, because figuration is also about constituting now and dealing with what has been constituted, and how do we deal with that? How do we work with people who are entrapped? How do we deal with entrapment? How do we, as producers, you know, of ideas, producers of symbols, producers of meanings, how do we deal with these entanglements, you know, and at the same time work with these projects of liberation, projects of emancipation, you know, and projects of value making? And as I think Thelma was talking about, the importance of being human, again, which is a really central project that we do at HUMA. You know, what does it mean, you know, to begin to unpack this humanity as these kinds of people that we are? What does it mean, you know, to unpack this humanity in a world in which we want to inhabit, but at the same time we want to uninhabit? And I think we have a long history of these debates in knowledge production, whether we are going back, you know, to the long debates about what we should do with the colonial, moving to debates about the post-colonial context, and also shifting to debates today about decoloniality. And I think that at the end of the day, when we see us, it's not just about when we see us, it's about also how we see us, and what we see about us, whether we can actually see us, and whether what we are seeing is us. Because if we take figuration seriously, it also means that even though what we see and what is figured or what is represented represents something that is original, but when the world precedes you, what does it mean to begin to talk about that which you represent and to be engaging with that which you represent as you move towards emancipation. So I think for me, that is the crucial question. I'm going to end with a small anecdote that I met a friend of mine, a Dutch friend of mine, told me the story about driving through Cameroon. You know, when you drive through Cameroon, it's a lot of driving on long roads, you know, and because the roads are so long, you have to stop somewhere, you know, to eat, to go to relieve yourself. And this a Dutch colleague, a white Dutch, a woman, had stopped at this place called Makenene. To eat plantains and to eat plums. And as she stepped out, this black man ran to her, you know, and held her and said, "Finally, someone familiar." You know, this was a colleague who had returned to the country to seek his roots. He had come to Cameroon to seek his roots. And suddenly found himself entangled in this process of figuration, of figuring out, and dealing with particular symbols and also particular aspirations or nostalgia. And suddenly in one place discovered that what he was longing for was actually something that was quite banal and very strange and different. And also what he was running away from was something that he found familiar. So this white woman for him was so familiar in the sense that it represented something stable and something familiar and something comfortable. But at the same time, you know, it's funny because this white Dutch woman, a friend of ours, is someone whom we nickname her Mother Africa, because we think that she is more Cameroonian than we are. And she could not understand what he meant, you know, by, you know, finally something familiar, because actually she was invested in running away from this thing that is called familiar. This is what I call entanglement and these scrambled signs that we actually locate ourselves in today. So in this debate and this discussion, I think it's any easy answers would push us into cul-de-sac. So engaging with these debates about whether we should abandon that which we see authentic, that which has frozen us in time, what we should do with time, how we should shift with time. Some of the key questions that many scholars, whether it's African feminists or African Americans or people, those who deal with decolonial work or post-colonial work have dealt with, are really some of the key questions that should be driving us today. What should we do with Black and how should we figure it?
I really am interested in what you complicate as prefix in the very use of the term Black figuration, and it is something that then I think what I may have entered into some conversations with some of my colleagues about was, does Black figuration itself begin also, along with new narratives being formed, or an alternative or various multivocal subjectivities being formed from a sense of alternativity? Might Black figuration also be canonizing in new ways the idea of placing the Black in front of figuration? It's a sort of a new positionality on the act and the gesture of figuring ourselves in the world. Koyo, comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there are so many angles, you know, that we can talk, but I think that I would like to share really the impetus, what drove me and the team to really start thinking around this subject matter, and also to develop such a vast program around this that would carry us for the next 2 years in multiple forms. As we are invested in making Zeitz MOCAA really a very important site of, you know, knowledge production, thinking, presentation, dealing with ourselves. It was also using anecdotes. I remember many, many years ago, I found myself in a program in Brazil with multiple practitioners from various disciplines. And I remember very vividly the Malian filmmaker, Abderrahmane Sissako, who was there presenting one of his most beautiful films back then, which is Sokolo en attendant le bonheur, Waiting for Happiness. And in his introduction, he said something that struck with me. He said, you know, the world is so, Earth is so round as people are. There is no north, there is no south, there is no east, there is no west. And we are all in the same circle, so to speak. And he also said that there is no such a thing as the north that is always happy and the south that is so-called always miserable, so to speak. And I think that in all my work and endeavor, my really drive curatorially, institutionally, is about creating a language and a space for ourselves that speak to ourselves, particularly because our humanity, our practices, our achievements, our histories have been so defined by other or by proxy, or are so read and translated and interpreted always in relation to, and never really in relation to ourselves. So I like to say that with the work that we are doing at the museum, we have come to a point where, if we say contemporary artistic curatorial practice of the past 40 years, let's say, to a point where it is so important to speak to ourselves, as opposed to constantly proving to others who we are or who we are not, actually, talking about suffix and prefixes. So it is really an urgency for me. And that's one thing. The other thing that I've been looking very attentively, and I think we all contributed to this moment, Thelma particularly through her amazing work, Divine through his amazing research in social science. We have come to a place that I think Tina Camp wrote it in her amazing book, Black Gaze, where she says, we are really amidst a Black artistic renaissance, another renaissance where we found ourselves at a moment in time where we have powerful brokers in all walks of life, from economy to science to art to you name it. There are powerful people of African descent having amazing voices and amazing achievements. And I think that this is unprecedented in the temporality of Black humanity. And that is really also something that I think it is, makes the difference, basically, makes the difference in terms of what we can do, how we should harness that moment to really contribute. Of course, I am a passionate of institution building on the continent, and to harness that moment to really write new chapters or different chapters of our existence and of our experiences. So artistic practice, and particularly painting, that has been recurrently and endlessly over the past 20 years declared dead, uses a language that I think we have not necessarily used enough to translate, to interpret, and to represent to ourselves. So when And I like to make that intonation. It's not when we see us, it's when we see us. Because it's the weight is about we seeing ourselves and how we perceive ourselves and how we project ourselves through the power of art. So it is immensely important to discuss this, to represent this, and also the art historical research that is being produced at different institutions and also that we are invested in at Zeitz MOCAA. I mean, the sheer joy, basically, just to find out about all these artists and find out about all these works, find out about, you know, if you look at the Congo, for instance, which is endless, immensely, and the pleasure and the enjoyment we are having in putting together this exhibition and bringing it particularly, I mean, for me, I've always insisted on the fact that the continent is such a matrix, you know, for everything Black in ways that I don't think you can think about Blackness, you can think African-American, you can think, you know, Caribbean, you can think Brazil, you can think Cuba, without bringing it back to the continent. And I think that the ways in which the continent is seen, the continent is perceived and represents itself, cast a light or a shadow on everything else that derives from it. So the interdependence of Black existence is absolutely, you know, related and to the continent. And to just finish that, I mean, the projection, particularly in figurative paintings, we are talking about the poetics of Black figuration, you know. I like to sometimes talk about the Kerry James Marshall effect somehow, you know, I mean, Kerry James Marshall, Thelma can certainly speak to this artist much better. He was a studio, I use an alumni of the studio museum. And the Kerry James Marshall effect is the very fact that here is a masterfully, immensely knowledgeable, skilled artist who has developed a visual language, an unapologetic visual language that is rich, textured, and brings in the experience of Black life in ways in which, of course, that stem from artistic genealogies that it has been influenced by, but also projects it and brings it to the next level. So what I like to call the Kerry James Marshall effect, and what you see a lot in younger artists of African descent, be them African, African-American, and everywhere else of the diaspora, is the power and the kind of dynamic that this moment gives many of the practitioners to really put out there those stories and those visual stories that need to be put out there.
I mean, I really love the notion of projection across, you know, what I often end up referring to as a global hierarchy of Blackness. So I mean, right now we do have a question that's been put forward that I think is speaking to the kinds of distractions that occur when we don't form our own vocabulary, as you say, Koyo, around a vocabulary that we can employ to relate to in relational ways across identities, across geopolitical essentialist contexts. As artists and practitioners of African descent. The question here really is pointing to what we ought not to concern ourselves with when it comes to this moment in Black figuration. The question is, can you speak about the market's effect on what is now the zeitgeist of Black figuration in the world? is it a different kind of commodification of Black people? And you know, it's again about sort of thinking beyond a sense of representation of Blackness and Black figuration in its many forms, historically and in the contemporary moment, that is not in relation to or in proxy to, dare I say it, whiteness, dare I say it, white capital, white power. I mean, it can be a pretty intense discussion if we were to spend too much energy on that. But Thelma, do you perhaps have a response to the thread that Koyo was quite emphasizing quite beautifully about why we need to form a new vocabulary and understanding of the power of figuration?
Yes. No, I'm completely inspired by Koyo's desire to create this new vocabulary, and it feels that this exhibition gives us the chance for a canonical shift. I think, you know, in the question and another that's there, it also is about getting out of what I think is this sort of problematic dialectical that can happen when we're talking about Black art between abstraction and figuration, right? These practices are read through some sense of the more specific validity of one versus another. And so it feels to me what the possibility in this moment is in this new vocabulary to take in not simply the place that figuration might have as these works live within these larger art histories, right, where they represent representation, resonance, recognition, but also to consider them when we were thinking in this sort of cross-cultural, within the culture, this dialogue that can come when we are thinking cross-generation of Black artists, and in these different localities where this idea of the visual and visuality can have shifted in profound ways. I mean, I think that sometimes when we speak about figuration, the dialogue can be highly simplistic. And in many ways, art historically, sometimes these works can be treated only for the quality of figuration in them and not the sort of other aesthetic impetus that can make them happen. So I think this moment, both the moment that is defined by the market, right, and the way in which, you know, I think the word used was commodification, certainly, but perhaps when I am being less cynical about it, I would say it's more about how this moment desires these images, right? Like why in this moment do we see, right, the market needing these images, needing artists to create in figurative ways such that it then becomes a way to define, right, art of this moment. But I think this project and this exhibition are going to allow us to maybe unpack or untie, you know, some of what have long been the more simplistic ways in which, right, the art histories have captured, right, what this means, and deeply sort of engage in what for me has always been the deep conceptual underpinnings of figurative making by Black artists.
Absolutely, there is there is that danger of oversimplification, absolutely. And so I would like to also then return to the relational in the title of this webinar series in an attempt to complicate that as well. What is the dialogue that we enter into when we think of the many subjectivities and conceptual subjectivities of Black figuration from a spectrum of traditions, so Black modernism from the continent versus, you know, like what is the complication? Who is the we and who is the us, and who encompasses you know, those global sort of positionalities. That's something I would put to Divine, who very much is I think sort of.
But before you put it to Divine, I would like to, you know, you said and Thelma said something, and the question a member of the audience asked. There are a few things, you know, that I think I would like to answer to. The idea of figuration, you know, Thelma refers to the relation of Black abstraction and Black figuration, and the idea of figuration not being abstraction or conceptual. I think every art is conceptual at the basis, because it demands an idea, and the forming of that idea and the execution of that idea by the artist is concept already, regardless of how it is executed. So figuration is also highly conceptual in many ways. And to talk about, I mean, the question was also about this moment in time and the sort of the commodification. I like that question a lot, because it sends me to think about ownership, and it sends me to think about who owns our art, who is supposed to own our art, and that is also related to who owns our institutions and who is making our institutions. And as a you know, and I think it is quite important to understand it also, the work that Thelma does, the work that I do, even though we are not in the market, our work very much feeds into the market, and it's also part of educating our people to understand the importance of contributing to institution making, to understand the importance of collecting art, to understand the importance of, you know, contributing to the education of art from the youngest level to adult life, so to speak, and to understand really the role that different patrons of various walks of life have to play within that, you know, structuring or building of that work. So it is absolutely, of course, the market about Black figuration is extremely hot currently, from an institutional perspective, from individual and private perspectives. And this is, I think, where African or African descent collectors, African American, Brazilian, Cuban collectors and patrons need to really step up their game in in a very important way. The United States is, of course, extremely advanced in that field. The Caribbean lesser, but on the continent even less. And this is also, I mean, Zeitz MOCAA is also part of, you know, participating in, you know, facilitating that emergence. So it is really a very important question. Divine.
Yeah, I'm enjoying listening to these very deep insights and reflections, you know. Yeah, and just to agree with, I think, agree with Koyo that any process of arts making is actually a conceptual process. I think that's a given, that we need to take that as a given, because it's a process, as you say, of constituting an idea, you know, developing that idea and then bringing it into life, you know, into meaning. So I think every production, every creation itself is a process of concept making. And I like your challenge about the search for new vocabularies, and I'm very curious to see how that develops. You know, over the past years, I was intrigued by the work of I think it's Zeitz MOCAA, who works a lot with the question of interpretation and translation, and argues, borrowing I think from Bruno Latour, about black boxing, the fact that scientific vocabularies in particular have a black boxing effect because they hide their own histories, they hide their own sociologies, and they hide the fact that they were produced or created in a particular moment and a particular context. And it pushes that it's very important that in order to see us, that is to make our lives more legible and more intelligible, that we have to find vocabularies that make more sense, that help to explain, how, who we are, what we are, and where we come from and where we are going to. And I think when you ask the question, who is we and who is us, I think we is this vocabulary, partly this vocabulary is enabled by this vocabulary, and we can only see us through this vocabulary, through conceptual frameworks that make our worlds more legible, and that makes our worlds more intelligible. So there are two things: that there's legibility and there's intelligibility. So it needs to make sense, because the anecdote I told before were people who were lost in translation. I keep talking about entanglement because we need to disentangle, but in order to disentangle in a world that precedes us, we need this a conceptual or these concepts or vocabularies that actually really help to make sense of that place. But the we is quite problematic, because and I think that's where we all get trapped, because what is we? What is we in a world of encounters? What is we in a world that is made of border crossings? What is we in a world that is made of continuous meaning making? What is we which is made in a world where, we, in a way, we've become some kind of hybrid? I often say that I find it problematic, for example, to represent myself as an Afropolitan, which is such a great, I love it so much, but what does it mean, to think as an Afropolitan, to think for others, to be the body through which people, the lens through which people see or enter the continent? What does it mean, And I think these are really things that should push us, because when we talk about figuration, all of these different, I think, ontological experiences, these very phenomenological experiences are quite key, to help us to understand what this is about. In the 1980s, for example, from the African continent following a structural adjustment, lots of people left and immigrated from the continent, and those who immigrated were particularly people with possibilities and opportunities, and at that time there were people who were connected, and it's interesting that this group of people today, very powerful and very important, who constitute the intellectual core of the continent globally, are the lens through which we figure and understand. So what does it mean to begin to think about abstraction or think about figuration through these eyes and through these lenses, and I think these are quite really tricky questions that we need to really push, and that's why the we question is not so easy. When you say when we see us, that we is not so easy. And then you have this next issue, which is see, and here again, just to try to provoke and push us to think further, because we have to unpack what we mean by see, because seeing is also something that we have inherited, a means by which we privilege a particular way of inhabiting the world and a particular way of figuring the world. So what does it mean, you know, to emphasize this particular lens? And we have to unpack what are we losing when we emphasize that we have to figure the world through this particular form. What are we saying? So I think we need to also figure that out as we are figuring this figuration. And then the third, which is about us, because us today has come to mean really lots of things. That's why I think, Koyo, the question about the markets is really interesting, and it's interesting that you as part of your response, you indicate that we are not in the market. I know we are not the market. Something which we others will contest and say, once you are participating in this ecosystem of circulating circulating images and circulating figuration, you're already participating, you know, in this commodification. So this us has become something that is scrambled, something that is entangled. And can we really talk about us any longer? Can we talk about we any longer, when we are inhabiting worlds that we would have never inhabited before, when we are constantly border crossing on an everyday basis, you know, when we are in a way very active in this constitutive act of representation, of representing that which we deny in a particular way. I see people having debates about, well, no, this artist, you know, even though this artist has represented blackness in a way that we would consider very distorted, but it is a black artist, you know, who has made that representation. So I think these are really key debates, key discussions, because entanglement is what constitutes us today. And what do we do with that? You know, what do we do with this entanglement? Because in a way, we should not end up pushing ourselves to a cul-de-sac where we actually think that there is a particular way as Black people to figure Blackness, you know, because in the end, we are figuring the world. We are not just figuring Blackness. We are figuring the world. We are contributing to a way to see the world, to inhabit the world. We don't want to live this world of suffixes, of prefixes. You know, we want the world to understand that we actually are figuring the world, you know.
I would like to add something. I think that, I mean, we title our conversations "The Poetics of Black Figuration," and by thinking about it and preparing to it, and of course, over the course of the whole research that we are doing towards this program, I think that there is a sense, or even an expectation sometimes, of artists of African descent to speak to, work to represent the struggles, the pain, the traumas, and all these reductive tropes that are real of our existence. We cannot deny it. But at the same time, I think where joy, wealth, opulence, and even decadence become forms of resistance, it's where, you know, when you can talk about tenderness, you know, talk about love. I mean, Thelma was referring of her show about Black romantic desire, you know, dream, and that really speak against this normative, stereotypical kind of casting on struggle, hustle, pain, and what have you. So, and I think it's really central for me to and to referring to what Abderrahmane Sissako was saying over 10 years ago, that the complexities of our existence, the complexities of our experiences are not limited to, you know, our struggle and our pain. And it is absolutely urgent and fundamental that we address this, that we should not even address, because it's not about being addressed at all. It's just to live it, show it, own it in ways that really assert our being in this world. So I strongly believe that, you know, I mean, when we look at, I mean, that's why I like to refer to the Kerry James Marshall, because his practice has really, you know, broken grounds in terms of seeing Black experiences in an art historical way that is absolutely on par with any other, you know, grandmaster of painting. So that, I think, is quite important.
Yeah, Koyo, I think that's incredibly important. And if I might add, I also think, to complicate this conversation, that when we think about Black figuration, we have to think about it including portraiture, but also think about portraiture as separate, right, from Black figurative painting and Black figurative art. And I think that unpacking also gives us so much more depth of understanding, of thinking about how this work has existed historically through these various traditions, but also it's an interesting way to think about some of the work being created right now, right, through that distinction of being aligned, but also different in many ways.
Yeah. Tato, I see, and in addition to that, somebody posing a question if it's really enjoyable and refreshing to have a conversation centering Blackness in such a radical way. I mean, it takes us to what we were discussing before we began, that on the one side, it's quite exciting. I think it's just great, because I think Koyo was talking about the importance of having to own it, you know, and this takes us back to the debate about modes of African self-writing. What should we do with this thing? What should we do with this consciousness? What should we do with this experience? And is it something that we just need to abandon and then move on and count our losses and then continue into the world, or is it something that we should find a way of continuously figuring it out, and you know, seeing how we deal with what I could still call this entanglement, because we have to be part of this changing world, but at the same time frozen, you know, in this time of I think of what I think it was Mbembe was talking about, monologues, you know, going back and talking about these monologues. But on the one side, I think it's great that there is space to have this conversation and to continue to have this conversation, and that these are really important debates about how we inhabit the world with this particular what has been figured or represented as an affliction. You know, as I think it's when you go as far back, you know, whether you're looking at the Black Atlantic, whether you're looking at a lot of the debates in the African diaspora, whether you're looking back at the fights, debates and discourses around decolonization or colonization, go back to Aimé Césaire, go back to Senghor, go back, you know, or you're looking at the works of Obioma or Yorenke, or all of these scholars. It's engaging with the same a question, you know, what should we do with this condition, because it's become a condition, you know, also, but what should we also do with this, with these multiple and what one could call resilient representations of figuration of what we are. So I think it's important to engage that. I think there is something very disruptive about insisting that you have this condition, you have this discussion and this debate. On the other side, it's the pain of it that, and as Koyo was saying, that in 2,000 years, we are still going to have this conversation, and the pain that we are responding to the same question that others posed 200 years back, 400 years back, and recycling it, you know, where we are trying to deal, I think it's Mudimbe who talks about the colonial library. We are still talking about the colonial library, you know, quite deeply. We are still talking, like Koyo was saying, we produce arts, you know, for the market. Lots of people who produce arts for commodification. We are still talking about extraversion, you know, to reference Apollon Otonji. So it's quite painful that we are marking time, still engaging debates of negritude, you know, still going back to some of these really vexing questions that we think we should transcend. But despite this pain, in no way should we think that this is a conversation that we should abandon. It is not a discussion about Blackness, it's a discussion about being human. It's a discussion about how we inhabit the world, because marginality is about how we cohabit, how we coexist. When we discuss feminism, example, it's not just about women, it's about how we become human. You know, when you discuss race, it's not just about Black, it's how we become human, you know. So at the end of the day, this is about how we inhabit a world in which we actually see each other as human. And I think that's the question that we are posing. When do we see us as human? And when do we see us as a collective community, global community, as human? Where do we get to a space where we stop using these prefixes and suffixes, and where it's just human?
It's so beautifully said, Divine. But I disagree with you a little bit on the point of when you refer to the fact that we are recycling ideas. I don't think that we are recycling ideas. I think that we are in a continuity of ideas that evolve and that reclaim space in different moments. And we as practitioners, be them curators like Thelma and me, and institution makers, social scientists as yourself, you know, Fanon said this very often misquoted thing about every generation has a mission. Either they achieve it or they betray it. So, and I strongly believe in the continuity of ideas and how these ideas transform to represent the zeitgeist of their time, and artistic practice is exactly the same. So, and I see that there is a question in the chat talking about canon and canonizing, and it really hints to how do we participate, contribute to the expansion of the ideas, to like continue. It's like a quilt, the practice of making quilts that, you know, 2 generations are continuously being expanded. So the very notion of the expansiveness of Blackness, you know, the very notion of what is reshaping the circulation of Blackness, or on a global scale, that we are all doing in many ways. So I strongly believe that it's of course, and also the temporalities. We've been stuck somehow in the colonial temporality. I mean, the history of the continent, as we all know, is vaster than that, and also the history of African or Black aesthetics is vaster and larger than that. And that's why, you know, for me, the engagement now with Black figuration is so important, because it allows us to, you know, enter spaces, present work, engage with thinkers and artists who have really demarcated themselves from this idea of pain and struggle, and really embrace all the multiple forms of the beauty that we have. So I think it's that is really what is driving me in fundamentally.
Absolutely, and I think that was a really strong position on what it means to canonize. We have another question here, and perhaps it is a continuation of that thread. The viewer says, is it possible to read the plethora of Black figuration in relation to the democratization of cultural production, where the idea of art and its institutions are no longer the only arbiters of taste, especially with social media and the self-fashioning happening there? And I think that then becomes, taps a little into the distinction, Thelma, that you made earlier between portraiture and figuration. What we see on social media often references the language of portraiture, self-portraiture, but figuring is a heightened gesture, I think a heightened language for sure.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting and, you know, very precisely correct question, to which I would just simply answer yes. But the way in which I might complicate it is also, I think, and Koyo mentioned this in her introductory comments, but I also think it has to do with the change in the landscape in institutions. I think the set of spaces that are defining the canon, right? And I say that, you know, as the proud director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, an institution over 50 years old, devoted to the work of artists of African descent. Our first exhibition, when we opened in the late 60s, was of an abstract artist. And that was very radical at that time, because the idea of Black art, there was a certain outside of the community perception that that needed to be work that very literally depicted Black people and the Black experience. So when you read some of the articles and the reception of the Studio Museum's first opening with the amazing work of Tom Lloyd, a light sculpture maker, right? So right in the midst of the aesthetic ideals of that moment, it also brought up this issue of this institution, a museum defining itself as a Black museum, now in the space of canon creation, right? So not just canon revision, right? Not just the work to say what should be in those canons we've been excluded from, but actually the work of what is the canon that we can create. And so, you know, when I think of the artists who were around us at founding, right? And you had, you know, figures like Elizabeth Catlett and Romare Bearden, Jacob Lawrence and Mel Edwards, Norman Lewis, and, you know, William T. Williams, Faith Ringgold, you know, and you know, Emma Amos, and I could go on and on. What you see is this trajectory that goes across all of these different aesthetic strategies. And an institution, like inherent to institution building, is this knowledge making. And the knowledge making was about creating canons, right, that are expansive in their ability. So I think the question, the answer to it is yes, but the addenda I would add is that we need to think about, right, in these last 50 years, the sort of creation of institution, and I don't just mean bricks and mortar institutions, like my owner Zeitz, but even those spaces of intellectual production, right? Those groups of people, the art historians and critics who were creating, you know, and I don't want to call them alternatives, because alternative still centers, right, an idea that there is, you know, something that is central. But, you know, I'd like to think of these parallel histories and the way in which, and I think, you know, Koyo, that's why I found the we in the title of your project so profound and so poetic, right? Because that we really was the we that ties us all, right? The sort of global Black presence, this idea of not just the institutions, but these intellectual spaces that have been traveling around creating ideas about what the possibility, the breadth and depth of work that Black artists make, and creating complicated, rich, and important dialogues around it.
Absolutely, absolutely. With 10 minutes left, I wonder if it is worth taking any further questions, but I think the incredible positioning and repositioning that we've done tonight of Black figuration and its ties to the socio-political, its ties to the institutional, the weight of institution knowledge production, institutional knowledge production, that we can locate a kind of connection to it, to its histories, to its continuum, has been really, really fascinating. Koyo and all the speakers, I'd like to invite last comments, final perceptions and views, and what you imagine can further be expanded on when we think about the poetics of Black figuration.
I think, thank you, Tato. Well, to closing, I think that what is really inspiring for me and driving really is, first of all, being excited to be a contemporary of this moment in time and have the privilege to participate in this transformational period about, you know, how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves. And I also think that there is really a radical question here in the when we see us, you know, because it's not about only looking at the simply multiplying the representation of Black people, as Thelma so nicely put in the global presence of Blackness, so to speak. But really, it's about what it would mean to see oneself through the complex positionality that Blackness provides in many ways, and really also work through the implications of oneself. So I like to simplify it in saying that speaking to ourselves, because for a long time, and I remember referring to, you know, particularly on the African context, the work in the curatorial work in the 90s, of which I'm very much a kid of, so to speak, and the early 2000s as kind of advocacy activity, advocacy curating, sort of unearthing practices in ways in which that sort of, you know, bring forward, you know, voices and practices that haven't been seen. But for somehow it was always some way kind of not speaking to ourselves. It can kind of some way always showing to others that, hey, listen, we exist and we are great, so to speak. And I think that in the last 10 years, maybe social media helping, the gaze and the guise has changed towards ourselves. And that, I think, it is really now that the real conversations are beginning, because we are speaking to ourselves, and we have to speak to ourselves and really redefine the ways in which we want to be seen. and by our own vocabulary and by our own institutions, by our own, you know, professionals. So that's really what it is about.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a real intentionality to the way you've positioned that that kind of advocative, generative curation, this re-illumination. Yeah. Thelma, Divine, please go ahead. Some final notes, comments, positions to make.
Oh, yeah, it's been a great discussion. I'm glad that we have launched this today, and it's just been fascinating to be with my sisters in this really important discussion, and I do agree with Koyo, and I'll push it further. I think it's the Nigerian scholar, now of late, Hari Garuba, who spoke about the importance of creating new circuits of value, and that introducing new circuits of value into the world is, you know, really important for making us legible, making our experiences also more intelligible. And I think this idea of finding new vocabularies and new ways of seeing us, of seeing the world, it's a way of introducing new circuits of value. So it's not necessarily that we want to displace what is there, but that we want to enrich what is there. So this conversation is about enriching, and as Koyo said, expanding, not just expanding conversations that have happened, but also enriching to tools and frameworks that are already there. And I think that's something that that it's important to do. So it's not just about how we see each other, it's about how we talk to each other. It's also about how we listen to each other, and how we understand each other. And I recall, I think it is Hamid Dabashiu, and in his book, Can Non-Europeans, you know, Think, where he's having this debate whether Eurocentric or European scholars can actually think, but he's saying it's not that we cannot think, it's just that the others have to find a way to listen and to read and to understand when we think. But for that to happen, I think the idea that we have to see us is really important. Connected is a Pan-African world, it's a connected world, but it's a world that is pluriversal, that Blackness is also plural, but at the same time connected. So how do we enter that world but acknowledge that there's this pluriversality? And I think that's what we are pushing for here, and that's why institutions such as Thelma, such as Koyo's, such as many others, that it creates this space which is so beautiful to come and see so many people thinking the world without suffixes and prefixes, but also that it allows them to be part of the world. And I think at the end of the day, this poetics of Black figuration is ensuring that this pluriversality actually operates. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll simply also express gratitude for the conversation, for this project, and really maybe just will speak to the future and what I hope will happen over these months, over these next many conversations that you have organized around this, and for the exhibition and the publication to come. I think what it is creating are new pathways for us to not only, you know, I see in the comments, think of new names, but really come to new vocabularies, new ideas, new sense of the power and possibility that remains so important to these traditions as art traditions, but also as a part of our indelible, important, significant cultural legacy. So thank you. It's wonderful to have been in this moment in the conversation, but look forward to all that will come.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. This really has been a really giving conversation to begin our webinar series with. We are incredibly grateful to all three of our speakers. We're incredibly grateful to the graciousness of this conversation, the kind of feedback we've also received from our audience tonight. we already have a guest who wants to make sure that we continue with more of these really rich discussions as part of this webinar series. And of course we will. We have 13 more to go. And in fact, on April 12th, we have a new set of speakers who will respond even more in a much more incredibly layered way, and incredibly extended and sustained way around this notion of the notion that is inherent in the many notions that are inherent in the title of this webinar series, as well as the upcoming exhibition. We're pointing quite specifically in the next session on this dynamic and dialogical relationship that we find we've landed on with this title. So thank you so much. And I do want to point out that you may return to this conversation. This recorded session is available for a limited time on demand on this very platform. For our next session on April 12th, again, just click through on this link wherever you see it in our communications, our social media and marketing, and you'll be able to return to this exact platform and enjoy the next episode. I would like to again graciously thank HUMA, Divine Fur, and the Humanities for Africa Institution at UCT. I am incredibly grateful to Thelma Golden for making time. And I am also very, very grateful to our team, our staff members here at Zeitz MOCAA Museum, for their incredible support and guidance and research, and just helping us facilitate this production, as it were. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon again on April 12th. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
You've been all amazing. Thank you for your time.